The number of hours between your first bite of food and your last bite of the day may be doing more to protect your memory after 60 than any puzzle app, any supplement, or any brain game you've ever tried. A new study on exactly this came out just days ago, and it changes how I talk to my own patients about breakfast. Stay with me because in the next few minutes, I'll walk you through exactly what this window is, exactly what happens inside your brain when you get it right, and exactly why the researchers who ran this study were surprised by what they found in older women specifically. This isn't a fasting fad dressed up in new language. It's a pattern your brain has been quietly asking for the entire time. I almost didn't cover this topic. Eating windows and intermittent fasting have been talked about so much online, mostly for weight loss, that I assumed there was nothing new left to say. Then I read the actual data. The part measuring cognitive performance rather than the scale changed my mind by the second page. Here's specifically what surprised the researchers behind this study. Most eating window research up to this point had focused almost entirely on metabolic markers: weight, cholesterol, blood sugar, things you can measure with a simple blood test. Almost none of it had directly tested cognitive function in older adults using standardized planning and problem-solving tasks. When this particular team did exactly that, they expected at best a small or inconsistent effect. What they found instead was consistent enough and large enough that it's now prompting follow-up studies specifically in this age group. I've spent decades working with patients over 60, and one question I ask almost everyone who comes in worried about their memory has nothing to do with crossword puzzles or fish oil. I ask what time they eat their first meal and what time they eat their last one. The gap between those two answers tells me more than most people expect. A patient of mine, a retired accountant, came in convinced her forgetfulness was simply age catching up with her. She grazed constantly. Coffee with cream at 6, a snack by 9, lunch, an afternoon treat, dinner, and something small before bed. Nothing dramatic, nothing that looked like a problem on paper. When she narrowed her eating into a single 9-hour stretch and left the rest of the day for her body to rest, she told me within weeks that her mind felt, in her own words, less foggy. That single change was the only thing she altered. She hadn't started a new supplement, hadn't taken up a new hobby, hadn't changed her medication, just the hours. Here's what almost nobody realizes about the hours you're not eating. Your body doesn't treat the time between meals as empty, wasted time. It treats that window as an active maintenance period, one that only fully switches on once digestion has settled down and stayed quiet for long enough. Modern eating patterns: breakfast at 6, a snack at 9, lunch at noon, another snack at 3, dinner at 7, and dessert at 9 rarely give that maintenance period a real chance to begin, let alone finish. Multiply that across decades, it's not hard to see why so much of what we call ordinary, age-related forgetfulness may have a physical explanation hiding in something as unremarkable as a snack schedule. Before we go further, I want to be honest about where the science stands. This is still a young area of research, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But what we do know is compelling enough that I think every person over 60 should hear it, weighed carefully rather than dismissed. So let's break down exactly what happens in your body when you compress your eating into a shorter window. Because once you understand the mechanism, the study I mentioned earlier will make complete sense. 5 things happen when you do this consistently. 2 of them protect your blood vessels. 1 of them involves a cellular process that won a Nobel Prize. And the last one is the actual, measurable finding that prompted me to bring this topic to you today. The first thing happening involves something most people only think about in terms of diabetes: your blood sugar and insulin levels. Every time you eat, your blood sugar rises and your body releases insulin to manage it. Constant grazing throughout the day means constant small spikes, one after another, with barely any time for your system to fully settle in between. For your brain specifically, this matters more than most people realize. Frequent blood sugar swings are associated with damage to small blood vessels, the tiny vessels deep inside the brain, rather than the larger arteries most people picture when they think about vascular health. These small vessels are delicate, Researchers have recently found that a meaningful share of age-related brain damage traces back to exactly these small, deep vessels, not just the larger arteries responsible for heart attacks and major strokes. Compressing your eating window reduces the number of insulin spikes your body has to manage each day, giving those smaller vessels far fewer disruptions to contend with over the course of a lifetime rather than just a single afternoon. Does your day look like a string of small meals and snacks with barely a break between them? If so, your smallest blood vessels have likely never had a real rest since you woke up this morning. The second thing ties directly into the first, and it's a process your cells rely on constantly, whether you've ever heard its name or not. It's called autophagy, and it earned a Japanese scientist the Nobel Prize in 2016 for uncovering exactly how it works. Autophagy is your body's cellular cleanup crew. Cells accumulate damaged proteins and worn-out components over time, and autophagy is the process that identifies that debris, breaks it down, and recycles the useful parts. Here's the part that matters for tonight's topic. Autophagy ramps up significantly during extended periods without food, and it slows back down again once digestion resumes. Constant grazing throughout the day keeps this cleanup process perpetually interrupted, never given a long enough stretch to do its full job. Think of it like a housekeeper who's constantly told to stop mid-task every time someone walks back into the room. The work gets started, but rarely finished. A defined eating window gives that housekeeper the uninterrupted hours she actually needs, and brain cells, being some of the longest-lived cells in your entire body, arguably benefit from a thorough cleaning more than almost any other tissue you have. If you can't remember the last time you went 12 full hours without eating something, even a small handful of nuts or a piece of fruit, that housekeeper in your body has likely been interrupted every single day for years without you ever noticing. That's the second thing. Here's the third. The third thing happens specifically while you sleep, and it involves a system many people have never heard of, even though it was only clearly mapped by scientists within the last couple of decades. It's called the glymphatic system, and it functions as your brain's own overnight cleaning service. During deep sleep, your glymphatic system becomes dramatically more active, flushing out metabolic waste products that accumulate in brain tissue throughout the day, including proteins connected to Alzheimer's disease. This isn't a minor housekeeping detail. It's considered one of the primary reasons deep sleep matters so much for long-term brain health in the first place. This cleaning process works best when your body isn't also busy digesting a meal, since digestion and deep restorative sleep both draw on overlapping physiological resources. Your body, in a sense, has to choose where to send its energy and attention overnight. Eating your last meal several hours before bed, rather than snacking right up until you turn off the light, gives this overnight system a clearer runway to do its work instead of competing with digestion for the same limited resources. It's a small shift in timing. If dinner most nights ends within an hour or two of when your head hits the pillow, this is a direct physical reason your sleep may not be doing everything for your brain that it should, no matter how many hours you technically spend in bed. 3 down. The fourth thing shows up more gradually, over months rather than hours, and it's the one most people already associate with eating windows, just not with their brains specifically. Compressing your eating into a shorter window tends to reduce visceral fat, the deeper fat surrounding your organs, more effectively than simply cutting calories without changing timing. Visceral fat isn't just a waistline issue. It behaves almost like an active organ of its own, releasing inflammatory compounds directly into your bloodstream around the clock. Chronic low-grade inflammation of this kind is consistently linked to faster cognitive decline in long-term studies tracking older adults over many years. Less visceral fat generally means a calmer inflammatory environment for your entire body, your brain included, and that calmer environment is exactly the kind of setting where your brain's other maintenance systems, autophagy and the glymphatic system among them, can function without added interference standing in their way. Have you noticed changes around your midsection over the past several years that seem to happen regardless of how much you ate? Timing, not just quantity, may be playing a bigger role in that than you've been told. 4 things down. Before we get to the one that actually convinced me to make this video, tell me something in the comments below. What time does your last meal or snack of the day usually happen? I genuinely like to know because I have a feeling the answer for a lot of you is later than you'd guess if you actually timed it. I want to pause here and address a real concern, especially for anyone over 60. Compressing your eating window is not the same as eating less overall, and that distinction matters enormously at this stage of life, when preserving muscle mass is already a genuine priority. Within your window, you still need enough protein and enough total food to maintain your strength. This isn't a calorie restriction strategy dressed up in different clothes. It's a timing strategy, and the two are not interchangeable, no matter how similar they might sound at first glance. And now, here's the finding that changes this from an interesting theory into something with real evidence behind it. A recent 6-month trial followed older women who limited their daily eating to roughly 8 to 9 hours. No calorie counting required, simply a defined window. By the end of the study, these women performed measurably better on tests of planning and problem solving than women who ate across their normal, wider hours. And the difference wasn't subtle enough to write off as chance. Let that sit for a moment. Not weight loss, not blood sugar, actual cognitive test performance in older adults tied to nothing more complicated than when they ate rather than what they ate. This was a small study, and I want to be careful not to oversell it. 6 months isn't decades, and one trial isn't a mountain of evidence, but small, well-designed studies are exactly how larger discoveries usually begin. And this one lines up precisely with everything we just walked through about blood vessels, autophagy, and the glymphatic system. When a mechanism this well established meets a real-world result this specific, it earns attention rather than skepticism, at least in my clinical opinion. What makes this particular trial worth taking seriously is what it didn't ask participants to do. No calorie targets, no macro tracking, no specific foods eliminated. Just an hour range for eating, left otherwise up to each participant's normal preferences. That simplicity is part of why I think it applies so well to real life, rather than staying confined to a research setting. So here's how to actually build this into your life, starting tomorrow, without turning your entire relationship with food upside down. Choose an eating window between 8 and 10 hours, something realistic for your schedule, rather than the most extreme version you can find online. A common approach is eating between roughly 10 in the morning and 6 in the evening, though your own ideal hours depend on when you wake up, when you're active, and when you typically feel hungry. Here are a few real examples to make this concrete. If you're an early riser who likes breakfast, try 8 in the morning to 4 in the afternoon, treating your last meal as an early dinner rather than a traditional one. If mornings aren't your thing, and you'd rather skip breakfast entirely, 11 in the morning to 7 in the evening works just as well, letting you keep a normal dinner with family while giving up little more than your first coffee of the day being black instead of with cream. Neither version is superior. The version you'll actually follow for months, not days, is the correct one for you. Within that window, eat normally. This isn't about restriction or deprivation. It's about concentrating the meals you're already eating into a defined stretch of your day rather than spreading them out from the moment you wake until right before you sleep. Outside that window, water, black coffee, and plain tea are generally fine since they don't meaningfully interrupt the processes we discussed. What you're avoiding outside the window is food itself, snacks, cream in your coffee, anything that triggers a real digestive and insulin response. If 12 hours currently separates your first bite from your last, don't try to jump straight to an 8-hour window overnight. Narrow it gradually, an hour or so at a time over a couple of weeks. Your body adjusts far more comfortably to a gradual shift than an abrupt one, and you're far more likely to stick with a change that didn't feel like a shock to your system. Most of my patients find the first few days are the hardest part, and the habit becomes close to automatic somewhere around the 2-week mark. Some hunger outside your window is normal at first, and it typically fades faster than people expect. Staying well hydrated helps considerably since thirst is frequently mistaken for hunger, especially in the late evening. A cup of plain tea can also ease the transition without breaking your window at all. What doesn't help is white-knuckling through genuine hunger just to prove a point to yourself. If a particular evening calls for a small, sensible exception, one evening won't undo weeks of consistency. Holidays, travel, and family gatherings will occasionally push your window later or wider than planned, and that's genuinely fine. This isn't a rule you're breaking if a birthday dinner runs past your usual cutoff once in a while. What matters far more than any single evening is what your eating pattern looks like on an ordinary Tuesday, week after week, month after month, since that's the pattern your brain actually experiences most of the time. If you work irregular hours or overnight shifts, the exact clock times matter less than the principle itself. Anchor your window around your own wake and sleep schedule rather than the standard 9 to 5 day, and give yourself a genuine stretch of hours with no food at all, positioned around whenever your body's version of nighttime happens to fall. I want to speak to you honestly for a moment, not as a content creator, but as a physician who has watched this exact conversation play out in my office more times than I can count. For years, I told patients worried about their memory to do crossword puzzles, take their vitamins, and stay socially active. All genuinely useful advice, none of it wrong. What I rarely mentioned was something as unglamorous as what time they stopped eating at night. It felt too simple to matter, which in hindsight was exactly my own blind spot, not a reflection of the actual science. A colleague of mine, someone who trained in the same program I did decades ago, admitted to me recently that she eats her last meal around 10 most nights, snacks included, and has for her entire adult life. She's sharp, she's engaged, she's nowhere near retirement in her own mind. But she also told me, half joking and half not, that she's noticed more mental fog on the mornings after those later nights than on the mornings following an earlier dinner. She hadn't connected the two until we talked it through together. I've since had several patients run their own informal experiment, tracking how mentally clear they felt on days after an early dinner versus days after a late one. Almost every single one described the same pattern my colleague did, without me ever prompting them toward that particular answer. None of this replaces a controlled study, and I want to be honest about that limitation. But when a pattern shows up this consistently across patients who have never spoken to one another, it earns a second look rather than a shrug. These conversations aren't rare exceptions of my practice. They're an extremely common pattern hiding behind something that feels too mundane to investigate. The simple hours between meals, repeated the same way, night after night, for decades, without anyone stopping to ask whether those hours were helping or quietly working against the brain they were trying so hard to protect through every other means available to them. What strikes me most, looking back over my own career, is how much time I spent recommending mental exercises while overlooking a physical one hiding in plain sight. Brain training apps have their place. So does staying socially connected, staying physically active, managing stress. But none of those replace the basic biological rhythm of eating and not eating, feast and rest, that our bodies were built around long before any of us had a phone to practice puzzles on. Here's the lesson I keep coming back to after all these years in practice. We tend to look for complicated answers to the questions that scare us most, and memory loss scares almost everyone I treat over 60. But sometimes the most protective habit isn't a new supplement or a harder puzzle. Sometimes it's simply giving your body permission to stop digesting for long enough that its other systems can finally get to work. Now you know what that window does, and you know the actual research behind it, starting with your very next meal, not next week, not after more research comes out, tonight. Let's bring this together into one clear plan. An 8 to 10 hour eating window supports your brain in 5 connected ways. Fewer insulin spikes protecting your smallest blood vessels, uninterrupted stretches for autophagy to clear out cellular debris, a clearer runway for your glymphatic system to clean your brain overnight, reduced visceral fat and the inflammation that comes with it, and backed by a real 6-month study, measurably better performance on planning and problem-solving tasks in older adults who followed this exact pattern. None of these 5 require separate effort. They all flow from the same single decision about when your kitchen opens and closes each day. A question I hear constantly is whether this means skipping breakfast entirely. It doesn't have to. Some people prefer an earlier window, breakfast through mid-afternoon, and skip a late dinner instead. Others prefer skipping breakfast and eating from midday through early evening. Neither approach is inherently correct. What matters is consistency and an honest, defined stretch of hours where digestion gets to fully rest. Another question worth addressing directly. Does this work if you're already on medication for blood pressure, cholesterol, or another chronic condition? In many cases, yes, though the timing of certain medications relative to food matters, which is exactly why I'd encourage you to mention this change to your doctor rather than adjusting quietly on your own. A 5-minute conversation can help you fit this pattern around your existing prescriptions safely instead of guessing. One more question comes up often. What about morning walks or light exercise before your eating window opens? For most people, gentle movement on an empty stomach in the morning is perfectly fine, and some research even suggests it may enhance a few of the benefits we've discussed today. If you feel lightheaded or unusually weak exercising before eating, that's your body telling you to adjust the order, not a sign that the whole approach is wrong for you. I'd like to ask you something else directly, and I genuinely want your answer in the comments. Once you actually map out your own eating hours today, does the gap between your first bite and your last surprise you? Wider or narrower than you expected? A lot of people discover they're already closer to this window than they assumed, usually without ever having tried on purpose. And a lot of people discover the opposite, sometimes by several hours more than they would have guessed before actually counting. Either way, that number is worth knowing because you can't adjust a pattern you've never actually measured. If you found this video helpful, please share it. There is almost certainly someone in your life, a parent, a spouse, a friend over 60 worried about their memory, who has never once considered that the timing of their meals might matter as much as the meals themselves. Send this video to them today. Take care of your mind the same way you take care of anything else that's carried you this far. It doesn't need another supplement bottle on the counter. Sometimes it simply needs permission to rest between meals the way it was designed to. That permission costs nothing, requires no prescription, and starts the very next time you decide when to close the kitchen for the night. One final thought. Everything I've shared with you today is general information based on current, still developing research, along with my own clinical experience. It is not a substitute for personalized medical care. If you have diabetes, take medication that requires food, are pregnant, or have a history of disordered eating, please talk with your own physician before changing your eating pattern, since a compressed eating window isn't appropriate for everyone in exactly the same way. That isn't just a disclaimer, it's sincere advice from someone who genuinely hopes your mind stays sharp for many more decades to come. Take care of yourself, and starting with your very next meal, give your brain the hours it's been quietly asking you for all along.